Heidi, do you want to answer that, or do you want me to do it? Yeah, I think there's a PO problem. I don't think that cultivation is going to be consistent with the zoning or the general plan. So I think the move is to permit it only in AF, and that anybody who wants to cultivate applies for a rezone. What? No, it looked like nobody listened to what I just said.
No, I heard what you said. Yeah, so there's not like the existing forestry zoning aren't going to work.
And if we did go to AF, currently it has a 40-acre minimum. Would we potentially also amend that to maybe be 20?
Yeah, so what I think I gleaned from the Board of Supervisors yesterday is that providing an avenue for unregulated growers to become regulated is fairly important, and therefore we need to give them a zoning that they can get. So if, 20, I think probably general plan is the least we can do on timberland, right, Heidi?
Yes, that is correct.
So if we change the AF zone to be a 20-acre minimum, I think that's as fair as we can do, and give people an avenue for rezone. And then so, if you have TPZ or PO, you're applying for a rezone to get AF.
And over the long haul, if you wanted to try to make it accessible for smaller parcels than that, that would be a general plan amendment or change to do that. How would that work?
Well,
how many years would it take?
We're not supposed to really technically have any timberland smaller than 20 acres. So,
but there are a lot of them.
Yeah,
What was the question? The fact that there are a lot of non-conforming
the
PO that have underlying timberland land use?
The question was, if you wanted to incentivize people to come into the regulated market who have smaller parcels than that, is that a general plan amendment? And I think the answer is yes.
I would think so, because we would have to find some type of general plan land use designation that would be consistent with whatever the zone designation that would best fit that.
I don't think we would want to change the timberland designation
to
be smaller than 20 acres.
No, but that's actually what we started with pre-2003, and we got to the timberland with the 20-acre minimum. So it was resolving a different issue. So it'd be a step backward.
So am I understanding right that you're saying that we do have in this county TPZ zones, TPZ parcels that are less than 20 acres, right?
I believe that there are some that may be less than 20 acres.
There's a lot of POs that are less than 20
and so you have a general plan that's talking about that you shouldn't have that? Is that what your general plan is saying?
Ironically, some of the smaller TPZ zones have actually even a residential zone designation, and where the property owners are petitioning to remove them from TPZ and to rezone them to residential. There's just a lot of really long-standing weird things out there.
One of the things about TPZ is it's not actually parcel by parcel, it's contiguous ownership. So you can have a 2-acre parcel that's contiguous with an 18 and zone that, and then I guess sell one of them. And so you get a lot of weird things over the years, but I think when you come into the general plan saying you got a 20-acre minimum, where that really comes into play is when you're filing an application to rezone. We might have things that are smaller than 20, but we can't create new ones like that.
Right. So like in the PO zoning, the minimum lot size I think is 2.5 acres or something like that, as it's spelled out in the code, something small. So we're in areas where right now it's the land use designation is timberland, but there exists a lot of these small lots. Maybe the land use designation should change, and how does that
we
work?
tried to do that. I mean, an example would be Rock Creek. It's PO. We amended the general plan to be something that fit better with the existing land use patterns. Same thing with Big Flat and other areas.
And how does that work? What's that process like, and how long does that take?
To amend the general plan?
Is that what that is, to change?
Yeah, that was part of it.
That's the hardest thing we can do.
Okay. Just
It
good
sounds
to
to me like
understand it,
you
you know?
can't achieve your goal if you don't find a way to allow these properties that people are already using to become zoned ag forest. If that's what you're saying, it's going to have to be zoned ag forest to let this proceed, then the county needs to find a way to change their end to allow the properties that are currently being used to be zoned into ag forest.
Well, how big?
Because otherwise, you've completely just stopped your goal of bringing unregulated people into the regulated system, right there from the get-go.
Well, if that, so at some point it might have to be presented to the Board of Supervisors. If this goal is to bring them into the formal market, it's going to require a general plan amendment, and here's what that entails, and then see what their appetite is. Because, you know, timberland is the appropriate land use designation for a lot of these places. Like, they should be large parcels. And it would ultimately probably be easier for them to consolidate ownership or something and do lot line adjustments to make their parcels comply rather than change the general plan. But that's all deep stuff.
But how much is actually zoned ag forest right now? Not very much,
Not
right?
very much.
Or maybe virtually none, I
Yeah,
guess.
virtually none, I think.
So I guess my point to that would be that if the whole point of your ag forest zoning is to allow these small operations on them, then you wouldn't want large parcels to be zoned ag forest because you're only using a very small portion of them. And that's the reason you're zoning them that way.
I don't think the point of ag forest is to allow small operations. I think ag forest is the only zone we have where it's appropriate.
Right. I think with the density we probably end up looking for with this, it probably kind of makes sense to have a larger parcels. We don't want a lot of density going on. If we want space between them, then large parcels might work. Like in my neighborhood, for example, the land use designation is probably incorrect. You know, it's been a neighborhood with relatively small lots for decades.
Yeah, so if we change the underlying land use to residential, then nobody's going to be able to get permits to cultivate.
Right. So what other, it's not residential, it's smaller than forestry. It's more like agricultural.
Well, we'd have to make it like rural residential, and then make some decisions about whether we think that. So we might make.
How about a new zoning, a brand new zoning? What's that take?
The cannabis combining district's a brand new zoning. I just invented it.
It
can happen as long as it's consistent with the underlying land use designation.
Right. So long term, maybe creating a new zoning for those kinds of issues is appropriate.
If the really appropriate land use designation underneath the zoning is a rural residential, we could say rural residential is an appropriate place to grow cannabis, but not then zone the normal rural residential that has that would include like Fort Dick and stuff. Right, it would be a separate new zone there that allows cannabis in that rural residential, but not all rural residential.
Got it, like a new combining district.
Like a new combining district.
Got it, okay, cool.
It's a lot of work, but.
Yeah, so in the shorter term, ag forestry seems appropriate. It X's out a lot of smaller parcels, but it's a decent way to start.
Ag forestry is the way to start that's compliant with our current kind of historical jumble of things. But I think what you're talking about actually makes sense for a longer term solution. It doesn't even have to be that long term. You know, well, changing the land use designation, there's a difference between a substantial general plan amendment and a minor one. When we do kind of parcel by parcel land use designation changes to the general plan, we don't consider them major. But if we did like, you know, whole streets, whole neighborhoods, whole areas, it would be major, and then we get into like serious procedural hurdles. I mean, I don't know if you follow, Humboldt has been working on a general plan amendment for like 20 years.
Yeah.
That's
with a lot of contention.
There's a lot of contention. A lot of people, the general plan, a lot of people don't really understand how, like, you know, communities work and how government works, but the land use and the general plan is it's the heart of it. If you want to fight about power in a county, you got to fight over those land use designations. So once you get it set and agreed upon, people are pretty reluctant to open it back up again.
Slow moving wheel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
To be clear, So the ag forest, will that require a general plan amendment to allow a 20-acre parcel?
It will, and I might be wrong on this. This is Heidi's area, but I would think that'd be a minor general plan amendment, not a major one. So we could do it without, too much. A minor general plan amendment isn't much different than a zoning ordinance. Just the other day, not the other day, a couple months ago, we changed a land use designation for the Babbage property on Kings Valley. Like we can do it when it's one property here or there. And so like these minor alterations happen. The issue with PO is that the underlying land use designation that's consistent with PO is state and federal lands, not timberland, which is what most that PO is. And therefore, if we enact a zoning ordinance that says here's what you can do in PO, but it's not consistent with the state and federal lands land use designation, then we're in violation of our own general plan. So our hands are pretty tied on PO. PO is an accident of history where I think we thought the state and federal government was going to just keep acquiring most of our county, and so we zoned it for that, and then they didn't, and now it's in private ownership, and it doesn't make any sense. Now to change all of that is really problematic because, as you guys have pointed out, a lot of that land is smaller than 20 acres, but the appropriate zoning designation is timberland. So, if we try to solve that problem before we get to this problem, we're not going to solve this problem.
Well, so currently, and maybe I missed it because I walked in a little late. Currently, ag forest has what's the minimum?
Right now, it's 40.
40.
And what I think the minimum we could change it to is 20 and be consistent with the general plan.
And that's consistent with the general plan because the general plan talks about timberland being 20?
Yeah.
And so in order to change ag forest to some other minimum like 2 or 4 or 10, you would need the general plan to say...
We'd have to change the land use designation to not timberland, which, if it is timberland, that's the land use designation it needs to have. And if it's not timberland, we could change it to like rural residential, like I was just saying.
So what's the holdup? What's the problem then with changing the timberland designation in the general plan to being, let's say, 10 acres as opposed to 20?
Because I'll let Heidi speak to that, but it's bad policy. Nowhere in the state are you going to find a timberland land use designation that's probably even as small as 20. Usually it's 40 or 60. To keep these things operational, almost always timberland is zoned large parcels. Because if you're, harvesting timber, which is what the land is designated for, that's profitable on a larger scale. TPZ, you can rezone something TPZ with a 20 acres of contiguous ownership rather than the zone. I personally think that's too lenient because that's how we get these odd parcels zoned TPZ that then you can't rezone or change and it gets weird. So it's just a matter of public policy. I wouldn't recommend, and I don't think Heidi's going to consider changing the timberland designation below 20. Now, I think maybe we should just start out from the gate and say, let's consider rural residential for commercial cannabis outdoor cultivation and see where that conversation goes.
Rural residential zoning or rural residential land use designation or both, or are they different?
Probably both.
Okay.
Yeah, probably both ultimately.
Because like when I think out at the end of South Fork, a bunch of PO zoning, less than 20 acres, but its land use designation is a mix of rural residential and there's some ag.
There's some ag, yeah. Yeah, that's all pretty weird.
Right. Okay.
It's hard because you don't want to take like all of the historical weird things that have happened and make them stand in the way of progress. Nor do you want to ignore your historical weird things and create new historical weird things, they're going to bite you later.
Yeah, well, I guess this conversation really leads you in one of two directions, right? It leads you in, is there a way that we can more bring in all of these properties that are currently doing this? Is there even a functional manner to discuss about that right now? Because if there's not, then you just discuss it from the point of view of starting from scratch and ignoring everybody that's doing it, which kind of causes a big problem with the whole point of doing it.
I think for me, I don't have enough intel on what's currently happening to know what it would take to bring them.
Well, I would estimate that we don't have, it's hard to say, we probably don't have a huge number of outdoor mountain farmers here who are ready to get into the, permitted regime. But I would say maybe at least half of them are on parcels that are 20 acres or larger. So it's not like they're all, it's probably a split, or maybe more than half, maybe 3/4 are on parcels that are, there's a lot of 20s and 40s. So I don't know, I don't have an assessment of it, but it wouldn't block everybody out. I think it's a reasonable place to start and then consider this longer term solution, or figure out how to work in, if it's rural residential, it doesn't help the places that are just timberland that happen to be small lots, that's a much larger project, it sounds like.
Yeah, they'd have to legitimately be kind of like Low Divide, where it is a neighborhood.
Sure.
Rural residential might be inappropriate. It has to, can't just call things things. Yeah.
Sure, but that's like a larger, more major general plan when you're talking about a whole neighborhood versus a lot.
I think it would, and I think the reason one might be hesitant to do all that work and expense is there any guarantee they're going to come forward and become legal?
Yeah, there's not enough probably to justify that kind of a project, honestly. It's not a large enough neighborhood. It's not a large enough producing.
If we could give people on 20 acres an avenue to come forward, and then actually enforce the rest of them out of the marketplace, that'd be a huge win for the community.
Sure. If you had the contiguous ownership way of making the requirement, then that could work.
I don't know if AF has that. I'd have to confer with Heidi. But
oh, okay. The way it works with TPZ rezoning.
Sure. It might. I'd have to see.
That's right, because the zoning would have to be.
Yeah.
Well.
Maybe. I kind of hate that as law writing, but maybe if it's not that way, if we make it that way. I wouldn't really be in favor of that, but it's, it's something we can throw on the table.
Sure.
Because the opposite direction of that, trying to combine parcels into one is virtually, that's a much harder process, right? Like if you had two parcels.
Not for us, it is for the landowners.
You can do it.
Yeah.
For the county, it's basically just a parcel merger. It's not that big a deal.
But that would probably be an easier process.
It's actually pretty cheap.
If there was a contiguous basis versus trying to combine all your properties into becoming one parcel.
You have to buy your neighbor's properties and then do a lot combining and then rezone.
Yeah. And then you get into really fun bilateral monopolies,
right?
Which aren't my problem, but yeah, I understand why growers wouldn't want that.
Sure.
Well, if bringing existing ones into compliance is a priority, then is there a way we do the first year? We asked that your second year in operation. I think we're going to need like a window for people to.
Well, how does that work? When counties and cities seem like they just blatantly violate all the rules temporarily, and then I don't know how they get away with that. But.
So I think if we give our authorization to do it on like a grace period, I guess that's fine, and we just promise not to enforce, but you'll still be in violation of state law. And maybe they just don't have the resources or the energy to care.
How would you be in violation of state law? What do you mean?
If you aren't in compliance.
Well, the state allows the county to write a letter that says the applicant either is or will be in compliance with da-da-da-da-da, and then you can apply to the state.
We're not going to write a letter to say people are going to be in compliance.
Right, that's what I mean. That's why I wonder, because that's what provisional permit counties have been doing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
That gets into the whole thing that probably by the time we sort all that out, the grace period will be over anyway, right?
I don't know if that language extends to the annual licenses or not. It looked like it did, but I don't read it enough.
I've got a weird webinar on that I
Okay.
got to attend today. I'll find out.
Good luck. All right.
So what is Humboldt doing to allow their,
They just allowed it everywhere.
they just said screw it, or?
TP, all the zonings, they just added it. I don't know how, I don't really follow the details of how it did or did not conflict with their general plan, but they had it in TPZ, they have different zonings than we do. They don't have PO. So
Nobody has PO.
they have unclassified at the U zone, and then they have different timberlands. I don't know what their zonings are, but they pretty much just allowed it everywhere. And then pulled a lot of it back.
I haven't been paying attention to Humboldt since like 2 years ago, but
We have our own unique zoning and general plan issues kind of that are just our own,
Yeah.
sounds like.
just like Humboldt has its own unique weird problems, and I don't know if they've solved them or even tried, but they've
Sure.
got, I don't know.
That's different. I mean, greenhouses were principally permitted in TPZ and Humboldt for like the last 30 years.
Yeah, they have different rules altogether.
All right. Well, we also have on the agenda to go over the ordinance, cultivation ordinance. And I started reading it this morning. I didn't make it all the way through. Do we want to switch over to that, or do we want to keep going on what we're talking about now?
So, the ordinance timeline, the best case scenario is everybody's cool with it today. It goes to ERC tomorrow. It gets to the Planning Commission for November 3rd.
Where it will be denied.
Yeah. It will 100% be denied. I was at the last Planning Commission. I did an hour and a half on cannabis because, they wanted so much information. The attitude is pretty clear. Everything's getting denied by the Planning Commission. There's no room there. So it'll be at the Board of Supervisors in, I think it's November 13th meeting to be introduced, and the December 11th meeting to be approved. And we hit that timeline for at least some functioning retail manufacturing and cultivation. And then we keep working on the rest.
So for the public to know, the Planning Commission meetings are severely underattended by the public. They happen in the evening, at 6 o'clock, so that's a great time for anybody to make it after work.
It's the first Wednesday of every month.
They're on the first Wednesday of every month, right in
Yeah,
this
right here.
chamber at 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock.
So that might be a time to fill the boardroom with the public so that the Planning Commission can get on board with what the public wants or doesn't want.
So there's public comment there, and just
Yeah.
like any other meeting?
The only
Yeah,
public
open
comment,
to the public.
The only public comment on cannabis was Supervisor Gitlin, who was very staunchly opposed consistently.
Yeah, I didn't pay attention to the calendar, so I was not aware of that.
There was no
this
action
occurring.
item. It was just me
Right.
basically telling them where we are, how we got here, answering questions.
My bad for not paying attention. I would have been there, hang out with Roger. That would have been fun. Okay.
So I talked to the board yesterday and told them some of the details that had changed. They had pretty mixed feelings, it felt like, about a cap. The initial draft had it a 30 permit cap. I removed that, there's no cap. I don't think we need a cap. I don't legally like caps, and so I think this is better. Otherwise, this reflects the 2,500 square foot in A, not AE, on 5 acres or more. All the things that I think we were kind of set about, but then I missed the last hour of the last 2 meetings, so.
I saw this is just the coastal version that you emailed to
No,
us?
I should have emailed both.
Okay. I just must have just
They're
loaded
almost
one. That's what
identical,
I thought,
except the coastal has AI, because there's no AI in the
Right,
non-coastal.
and then the new building
And
clause.
the new building clause.
Okay.
I don't think there's anything different in there.
And then the one thing that we were talking about that made things a little or funny and not as good as it could have been because of the change at the state level with the mixed light definition and breaking that into 3 parts. And so I saw the definition for indoor and for outdoor. And then so if somebody's using a wattage of light that's in between those, what do we do?
We're not permitting those. Or we're going to have to basically, if you want to use something in between, you're going to have to get an indoor license.
Right.
And get taxed as indoor.
Sure.
Which means that financially it might not be viable to do
But
mixed light.
okay, I just want to make sure the definition didn't conflict because it's, you know,
Yeah. There's the
it looked
whole-
like you could almost slip out of it by dimming your lights. And
Well-
then, and you don't meet the definition of anything?
Well, so in there is a definition for outdoor, and on the, kind of the first permit requirement is every permit is designated indoor-outdoor. So
Okay, okay. So you can't-
You can advocate for one or the other, I guess, based on
Okay.
your operation plan. But
Okay.
you're going to be designated one or the other and then taxed accordingly.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, ideally, we would have had a mixed light tax too, but
Sure.
that was seen in the future a little bit more than we did or could.
All right. Well, I like the ordinance, the draft as written. I didn't make it all the way through the details, but,
A lot of it actually uses it is the manufacturing retail ordinance, and the only things in here are what's different. So what I probably should have done is also included a red line of the whole thing with the new stuff. But if you kind of compare the same, application, the same whatever, the definitions I added a couple, so that's in here. But there's the CEQA requirement will be the same, all that kind of stuff.
a lot of it looks like it carries over to timberland also.
The idea is that this is a centralized area and we can add it, it's flexible enough, and I think it is. So when we do a timberland ordinance, it should just end up being 1 more or 2 more sections in this overall thing.
Right, some more environmental details maybe or something like that.
Yeah.
Road details, perhaps.
Yeah, so the only road provision is that you have to have, some title.
Yeah, I saw the
some
private
deed.
road thing. That seems like that would work for everywhere.
Yeah, and then, there will be conditions sufficient to protect your road or whatever I wrote. What those conditions are going to be might need to be fleshed out. Honestly, to protect the permit applicant. Because some of the roads, the conditions might be so onerous, and we might have to decide if there's going to be a compromise and just let the roads be a little bad. And you do a little work to maintain, and you get your, I don't know.
Okay, so timberland cultivation, we can go over what the concerns are. I wanted to go over the zoning first so that we don't have to talk about lot sizes if that already, defines it. And we're already talking about 20 acres. And,
What do you mean?
oh, for outdoor timberland cultivation. Having the conversation about zoning and such kind of defines the parcel size that we're talking about.
So is rural residential and making a special zoning for rural residential in timberlands, is that just as viable as Forest Act?
I think so. I don't want to say too much about Heidi here to correct me. Rural residential, I think we've got like a 1 acre, a 3 acre, and a 5 acre or something like that. I would say we probably want to keep it to a 5 acre or even create like a 10 acre rural residential. Something weird like that. If we're going to be outdoor growing, I don't know.
What's the process like to create a new designation like rural residential 10 acre?
So to create a land use designation, The general plan amendment has a lot of requirements. It's consultation with every city, unit, district, federal government, state government, the tribes. There's going to be multiple public hearings, noticing, publishing, a lot of public comment. And so creating a new designation would be a lot harder than just taking what's already there and creating a new zone for that designation. So I guess if the largest is 5, the easiest thing to do would be to take that and change. These are questions for Heidi. If we're going to change all of Low Divide to rural residential, a 5-acre minimum, that might require a general plan amendment anyway, and therefore why not make it 10?
Right.
I don't know.
So.
Did she say when she's coming back?
She didn't know.
She didn't know.
If she can.
But, you know, I guess.
Did she say when?
No, probably towards the very end at the most. So you're talking about from, if it's okay to do an outdoor cultivation on a rural residential zoning, and if we, and right now rural residential is at a, what, like a, I don't know what the different acreage sizes that it's zoned at, but it's just one, isn't it? Rural residential.
No, there's different sizes. No. There's like a 1 and a 3 and a 5 or something like that.
There's a couple.
But it probably doesn't go past 5, I'm guessing.
Right.
I don't think so.
I think it stops at 5.
I think the biggest is 5.
And so, you know, talking about a general plan amendment to create like a whole new rural residential classification is one way to go about it. But if we were talking about using rural residential properties for this, would a different way to go about it just to be in the ordinance, talk about the size of the parcel you must have that's zoned rural residential? And then you wouldn't have to change all of the designations of the property. For example, like if I had a rural residential piece of property that was 9 acres and it was zoned rural residential 5+ or whatever, right? Since it was, you know, and we wrote in the ordinance it must be 9 acres or more, well then that piece of property would comply with the ordinance versus having to change the zoning of it.
So that would work if the underlying land use designation was 5 and you did, 7 or 9 was the minimum. That's fine. We just have to get the underlying land use designation.
It's the timberland designation that limits it, right? And so I don't think there's probably really enough areas that are like that for it to be worth worrying about at this point. I think probably more the focus of the conversation should be, if we're going to consider rural residential, then that's like a lot of the same concerns that the board had with ag lands and outdoor growing. It's kind of in a neighborhood and it's hard to mitigate the issues. I think of places like out South Fork where the weather is really great for it, but it's like a neighborhood. There's quite a few smaller parcels. And the ag land there, like it seems like, we've already X'd out ag land. I wish there was a way to separate that inland ag land from the coastal ag land, but I suppose somebody could rezone their South Fork ag land to something that works.
Yeah.
And so whether or not it's even appropriate to have, outdoor grows, in rural residential. Maybe it could be just with the big setback. If we're talking about 1,000 feet, that kind of wipes out most rural residential areas anyway. So those rare properties that happen to be rural residential but can meet a giant setback, I don't know if that's an appropriate way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Stuff like that can work. The problem is kind of the purpose of rural residential is because it is a neighborhood. It's kind of in between a neighborhood and agricultural land. So, the policy decision that it's appropriate there, just because people have been growing illegally on Low Divide, is maybe a tough sell to planning, whose job is to plan the land uses of the county, not necessarily react to illegal activity over the years. So, I don't know. Let Heidi weigh in on that. I think, to be productive, maybe let's put zoning aside and decide what size cultivation environmental controls. I don't know what there really is that needs to be specifically addressed. Cumulative impacts for.
It's really just super different conversations, I think, if we're talking about genuine timberland and sticking with that, you know, designation regardless of what's actually there, but considering it timberland versus the rural residential discussion. That's totally different. That's what's gotten some counties into trouble, is, you know, allowing, maybe going too big in rural residential areas. But I don't think that's gonna, I don't think politically that's gonna fly, honestly, rural residential zones. With the board.
Well, I think that the board has an idea in their head, residential.
Sure.
Rural, to describe it to them, is still residential. I mean, there's going to be some people around.
And I think that what's appealing about timberland is the ability to pretty much completely hide it. And that isn't really consistent with rural residential.
I've been supportive of just starting with the first tier, 2,500 square foot gardens. And maybe allowing 2 of those depending on accessibility or suitability. You know, maybe less restrictions on properties that are accessed directly by paved roads versus dirt roads. But that's sort of what, when we talked about roads and impact, it's the scale of the operation that matters there. That's kind of where I'm at. Eric leans a little bit more larger. He's not here to speak for himself. But.
Are you suggesting up to 2 2,500s per property, or you got cap up 2 licenses?
Yeah, either way, that's the same thing, I think. I'm not sure what you mean. But to 5,000 square feet, so yeah, right, per property. You know, but maybe not up, it would depend on, you know, specific conditions. Yeah, environmental suitability and access are what come to mind mostly with limiting the scale. What do you guys think?
What are the state permit sizes?
2,500, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, I think.
So you're already going to have to comply with water qualities waiver program, or whatever it looks like nowadays. I haven't looked in a while. I wrote into this cultivation ordinance no surface water diversions for any cultivation. So we're looking at...
That's consistent with the water board's direction.
Yeah, I don't think people should be diverting streams. That's kind of the primary environmental hazard that the illegal grows have created.
Sure. The water board will permit it with a 6-month forbearance period. And you can, if you're legally drafting, you can store it if you're forbearing for April to October or something. I think that's the way they'll permit it. So I don't know if the county needs to, you know, be in line with that, or just strictly say no.
I'd rather just say no, and so we don't have to enforce that or wonder, because the water quality is not going to come up here and check and see if you're,
exactly.
You know, I think it's easier to say no, and I think that's one of the primary historic environmental problems.
Right.
Then you're looking at groundwater, or you're looking at piping in, trucking in water.
That's not allowed either, yeah.
You can't truck in water?
No.
So you're looking at groundwater resources only.
Like you can for all of it. There's some provisions for it, but I think it's like limited. You can't use it as your primary source. And then if you have to use it, I forget the details of it, but you're not supposed to use it as your primary source.
I guess you can use like rain catchment.
Yeah.
You know, you can legally use rain catchment now, right? Because
yes.
As far as I know, yeah.
Because previously you couldn't.
No, you always could. I'm pretty sure. There's some states actually that are going after that and trying to ban it somehow, but it hasn't happened yet here. They encourage it. The water board actively encourages rain catchment. You may have to permit like your infrastructure. If you're building something, you know, you got big tanks or something, you may just be running up against building code things.
Yeah.
But just the actual catching of the water, I don't think.
I think for the most part, between the various regulations that already exist for grading permits, for wells, for septic, for, you know, appropriations, I think that most, like, I'm not that concerned with the environmental impacts if everybody's following the rules.
Sure.
And I think if we, like, we already basically have in this ordinance incorporated all those state requirements.
Sure.
All county requirements. I think is what specific things does cannabis pose that other activities don't, that might not already be caught? And roads comes to mind. Noise is one that I think the state might have weighed in on.
Yeah, the
more
generators, but they don't, they limit the size and the, you know, how modern your emission systems are. But other than that, it looks like you can use generators for primary sources for things all the time, and they don't have any, you know, I didn't see like a decibel limitation or anything like that. That might be something, again, something pretty unenforceable for the county, but it might not be bad to be in there if you had something continuous that needed to be complained about, you know, there was a nuisance.
Well, if you're submitting a operation plan, we can at least say at the beginning, do you have the equipment to do this in compliance with whatever? Do you have X number of solar panels? Do you have whatever, so that you're not just, you know, using a diesel generator?
It'd just be nice if systems weren't designed to run a generator 24 hours a day, and it looks like the state allows for that, you know, so there might be one change somehow. Limit the number of hours a day the system's dependent on a fuel generator.
Fuel generators. Yeah, so I guess traffic and electricity.
So water would be the most pertinent thing, I think, that limits or controls this thing. And so I have heard, and Jesse, you know way more than me about this, that the state had recently done some, you know, trucking of water, quote unquote, laws against that. So how does that exactly work, or what is the basis behind that law? Do you know why? Because it seems like
it's for the roads, I think. It's too much. If your operation's dependent on trucking of water, it's too much impact on the roads. I think that might have been part of the idea. Or it's difficult to ascertain where the water is coming from on the truck. There's a whole, to get any deliveries of water, you have to have a lot of proof and paperwork from the, and it has to be a, you know, a registered delivery company. It can't just be your buddy with a truck.
I think, you know, environmentally, if you're on a parcel that doesn't have any better access to water than a truck, you probably shouldn't grow there.
I think that was probably the idea.
Well, I was just listening to what you were saying, Joel, and so, like, you know, from the state's side of it, they allow you to take surface water during certain times of the year and store it. And then what you were just saying, Joel, was that you wanted to eliminate that. And so,
yeah, because the state's not going to enforce any of that. We're going to have to.
No, I know.
The state has more lenient laws than we do. That doesn't mean they're good laws.
Exactly the point. But what I'm saying is that that property did have access to do what it was doing until the county decides that you can't use the water that the state would say you could. And so if that's the case, then if the county had the ability to say you have to then truck certified water to your location, but I don't, that's what I was trying to figure out, if there was a state.
I'd say neither one, no trucks
that.
and no surface water. Either you have to get it from groundwater or you have to store it.
Or you have to be on some sort of utilities.
Yeah.
Which, you know.
A water district.
Yeah, I mean, there's water districts.
Well, for example, I have no idea what the Big Rock Water District
You can form
does,
a water district,
example,
you can form a mutual water
But
company.
like, for example, the Smith River Water District will not allow you to use the water they provide for commercial purposes.
Right.
So therefore, the water district in Smith River would not allow that to be the use of their water. Now, I don't know if there's any of the properties we're talking about, TPZ, that would have access to that water already, but like,
yeah, I don't know.
You know, I'm thinking about Big Rock Water District. I don't know, maybe they do supply water to some TPZ zone properties that potentially could change, and whether or not they have that restriction already in place. And so I'm just trying to think, if you start putting all these barriers to somebody acquiring water, then you're basically putting a barrier to the use of that property. So.
Yeah, but you know, when you're talking about land use, if that's not the right property use for it, then you shouldn't do it there. I don't think that we're going to be, I mean, so surface water diversions are the primary environmental harm that we've seen over the last 30 years, 40 years. I think, we're not sending people out there to check. That's never going to be something that we're funding. So in your operation plan, you really should be able to show you have enough water to do what you're going to do from viable sources. I don't particularly care if you're trucking it in, but I do care if you're on a crappy road and you can't handle trucking it in. So, I mean, we don't need a hard rule that says no trucking it in if the state will let you or something. But when we get down to those road protection conditions, it might
maybe
prevent
on
it
the
anyway.
pavement only, truck it on the pavement, whatever. But, yeah, I mean, this small kind of operations that I'm proposing, 2,500 square feet, doesn't use that much water. So if you can't come up with enough water for that garden, then you gotta go somewhere else.
So for all intents and purposes, then this discussion, they would be requiring to get this water through a well
Or rain.
or rain, which
Yeah.
Most likely be well,
Most
or somebody
likely
has, well, the state defines, let's see, sometimes ponds are surface water and sometimes they're not. So when they're fed by surface water, like on-stream ponds are surface water, but like off-stream storage ponds. So I think you could have a big pond that was off-stream that served your purpose, and that wouldn't be considered
It's not navigable water.
surface water, right? I forget the details on that one. But then there's an additional load of requirements when you have a pond from Fish and Wildlife. There's a toad that they want to make sure you're not growing, and some other rules that you have to meet to require.
I think we should allow emergency trucking if the
Yeah, I think that's the
state,
state's direction. It looked like they were doing it for just a short period of time, but it was like a stopgap measure.
Yes, if we have, some, we do have wells dry up once in a while, and, if that's
Sure.
something unforeseen, there should be some way to address that as an emergency.
Certainly.
Would you put road restrictions on it or limitations on weight? Or they would have to maintain,
The
or?
water tenders are standard. 2,500 or 3,000 gallons is like the most you can haul with a 10-wheeler. So it's kind of one standard weight for the maximum anyway. It's probably how you'd be doing it anyway. If you're paying somebody to truck it, you got to fill the thing up. And then just limit maybe the number of trips. It all has to be pretty documented. The state rules anyway, not that anybody's checking it, but I suppose you could limit the number. If you're going to call it emergency use, then you might pick some kind of number of deliveries in a year.
Well, the reason I was asking about the trucking of water is because that would be a function that the county could control. They can require a permit, certification for the company and or person who's operating like a company would be delivering the water via, like you would have to contact these certified people who would then be the people, they're certifying through the ag department or whoever else that this is their source for the water, so they're not getting it from.
The state has some definition for
Yeah,
that,
and
for
so
some
then-
license you had to have.
So then the county would be, because right now the county's probably not even talking about that
Right.
type of thing, but you would then license that, which would control that company would be in charge of making sure that their truck and their weight and all that stuff was compliant with where they were going.
I know people who bought water deliveries from Eureka because there wasn't anybody here to do it. I found that hard to believe. I'm like, you can't at least fill it up here and then haul the water all the way from Eureka. Anyway.
I'll look into those laws. I've never looked at water trucking laws.
There's some license the state wants the trucking outfit to have, like a licensed water hauler. It's a thing, I think.
Yeah, I know what the difference of California versus Oregon, and it happens a lot in Southern Oregon, but I'm sure the law controlling it is completely different.
Yeah, they may not have a license. It'll be Oregon style.
Some of the trucks I've seen hauling water didn't look like they had much license in Southern Oregon.
You got to be able to haul your own water around your own farm, though, with your own truck.
Yeah, I don't know all the laws about that, like again,
I don't think there's any restrictions on that.
well, like for example, gasoline. And then granted, gasoline and water are two completely different things, right? But there's a law that says how many gallons of gasoline you can keep in the back of your truck. You know what I mean?
I want to transfer.
For when you're just like loggers, people, logging trucks filling up things.
Yeah.
There's a certain size limit that's in place. So,
Yeah, there's a thing about self-hauling water. You can, the water board has, you're allowed to haul your own water if it's less than 250 gallons. I'm remembering that now. And that, you're exempted from the water trucking requirements and the licensing and all of that. So that's a way. I mean, you could really, I mean, every time you went home, you brought home a pickup load with 250 gallons, you could run a 2,500 square foot garden on that pretty easy, if you're careful. How about that, Joel? What do you think of that?
I stopped listening.
I know.
I'm sorry.
I'm remembering now the water board has an exemption for water hauling at 250 gallons. You haul your own water in your own truck, 250 gallons. So you could run your whole garden on that if you did that every time you came to town.
Where do you get that 250 gallons?
Yeah, that had to come from a legit source, but you didn't have to have proof for it at that amount. I think. I forget the details on that.
All right.
Exactly.
Well, I will just do some research on all of this.
You get it
water
from
trucking
your buddy down the
stuff.
road who's got a well.
Sounds like a bad idea to me.
Well, I know in Smith River, there's been a couple times where water tender trucks have been caught taking water out of hydrants.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they do like road work up in the hills, and they come fill up, and then they sprinkle
Sure.
water on the road. But they get caught from Smith River Water Services District
Oh, right.
for just plugging it into a hydrant. And so,
Yeah, water costs money.
yeah.
That's right.
Well, when we come back next time, I'll have learned all about water trucking, and we'll see what it looks like.
well, I think the discussion on the use of this property will on these properties in general hinges on some of these things, like the use of off-site water versus on-site water. Because if the county takes the position of you can only use on-site water, period, and it must come from a well or even from surface water, let's say, and we're talking about commercialized agriculture, we need to then look at the watersheds themselves, and that's where the limiting factors come in. So, for example, if all of a sudden it's okay and we have 100 permitted grows up, and we keep saying low divide, we keep using that as an example, all of a sudden there's 100 permitted grows sucking the groundwater out of low divide versus anywhere else. Well, that's a problem for that particular individual watershed, and so it's probably something on the county level that needs to do some research on what are all these different watersheds that we can be drawing from on these properties, and so is there maximum usages on each of these different areas?
The state has specific rules about exactly what you're talking about. They're monitoring the number of permits issued and their location by GPS and in relation to the density in particular watersheds. And they have a metric for it. I forget how it's figured out, but they stop issuing permits once they reach a saturation point in a particular watershed. And so I don't know how they're, if they run up against that yet. I know places like the Eel River where it's an issue. I think that's where they're looking, So I don't know how it's functioning yet, but I did read that as part of the plan.
Yeah, okay.
That's
So
just where the
groundwater sustainability
Sure.
is an issue. We can require meters, but yeah, then we need the science to know how much is okay. There's the Strategic Groundwater Management Act, SGMA. The state's trying to kind of make counties that need to manage their groundwater, manage them and meter and charge and do all the things. We've been fighting that since we are small and far away and feel like we have lots of water. But that's the kind of thing that if we can't avoid it, then this would probably come under that, I would guess. And we'd be managing the stuff anyway. So we'll see.
Just also talking about water, do we need to include or talk about anything about water runoff? Obviously, I'm not too familiar with the process, but I assume there's fertilizer runoff and other conservation aspects in regards to water byproducts.
Yeah, there can be, but there definitely shouldn't be.
Well,
Not to say that people aren't doing it wrong, but there could be. That's what the water board's permit really isn't about water use. It's a
about water
discharge
discharge.
waiver. Yeah, and which is weird because cannabis farms generally can't afford to discharge anything, especially when there's limited water.
well, if you're growing and you are compliant with the pesticide requirements and everything, is your discharge going to be a problem?
Well, so there's no pesticides that are labeled to be used on cannabis, so that's
They
not.
have some now, actually. Yeah, the Department of Pesticide Regulation has a list of cannabis-approved stuff now. And there is some
In
stuff.
California, that's.
Yeah, they just did it, yeah.
Just beginning on a few things, but really, essentially, the ultimate runoff issue is nitrates, nitrogen is fertilizer, and,
Yeah.
higher.
It could
in the
be.
runoff.
That's why they have.
That's where the whole grading thing comes in, like the
Right.
grading permits that you need to level and all that stuff has to come into compliance. So that
Definitely.
you're not on a slope where when it rains, it pushes all of the
It's the
nitrates
roads
off.
Yeah.
that the water board is most concerned with. When I communicated with them, that was their number one concern, is your roads, your water crossings especially, what's going on with the sediment that you create from running around tractors or trucks on your farm. That's the runoff, really. There isn't a lot of agricultural chemical runoff that would be coming from these farms, I don't think, because the restrictions are pretty tight on the usage of those things. But that's why the setback from watersheds, the water board's real strict about slope and your distance from, perennial streams or any class 1, 2, 3 stream watersheds that could carry sediment. They talk about soil and perlite, manufactured soil products traveling. Perlite blows around and does go into watersheds for sure. Trash, things like that.
I definitely think also it's specifically with water haulers. I've had a lot of experience with them up in the North Dakota oil field, and it's a rural region out there for the field, and the impact on the road system was massive. Obviously, it's not just the water haulers, but the amount that the sites needed was quite significant, and so it was a huge
Sure.
byproduct which degraded all the road systems. And I don't expect it to be the same volume as it is out there, but the impact of those 60,000 pound vehicles definitely impact that road system.
It'd be like having a logging haul road operating all the time, which wouldn't be suitable, so.
Well, also, I mean, what do you guesstimate? I mean, a legal grow per what, the small size that we're talking about. I mean, a tanker, 50,000 gallons. How much?
3,000.
3,000. Sorry.
Yeah.
So how much do you need?
Oh, right. How much water do you use?
Right. Do you need a truck delivered every
Yeah.
day?
Somebody could use a truck every day. I mean, it depends on how you're farming, but between 100 gallons and a couple thousand gallons a day. There's really a wide range because everybody does things differently, and so the way you farm is going to be dependent a lot on your water availability. Trucking water is expensive, though. So if you were getting a load every day for a 2,500 square foot garden, you'd be upside down before you finished, I think. Another good reason for not allowing larger gardens, because then you got incentive to bring a truck of water up every day. But that would, one a week, realistically, probably. You could probably run a farm on a truckload a week. But that's too much. I don't think we should be doing that like we're talking about. I don't think it should be like an emergency thing. If we're going to define that, then pick a number of deliveries a year.
Well, especially when we're talking about zoning, we result in a tight cluster of operations that are all nestled together. So it's one operation, 52 deliveries a year at most, times 15 other grows, 30 other grows, whatever comes out in regards to the ordinance. That would be a significant impact on the infrastructure.
It's a good time to talk about density, maybe.
I would think as far as the water trucking, just real quick,
hang on.
if we just issued a permits for them that covered the cost of the permit, it could be something where, we just have seven permits were issued for one farm over the course of the year. You might be evaluating whether that license, would be reissued without some infrastructure improvements.
What triggers?
That's actually an interesting point, is at the renewal stage, an evaluation of possible mitigation based on what actually happened to that farm. That's an interesting concept.
What triggers allowing somebody to do this emergency trucking? What are the criteria for that? I mean, because if we don't establish that, then I've found things constantly become an emergency to people when you don't, like, would it be, okay, are we in a USDA, you know, drought 1, 2, 3, like, what brings that on?
Sure. That's what I was thinking, if you just limited it to a number, you know, 3 deliveries a year, that's all you get. You know, make the most of your emergency deliveries.
Yeah, I would think the emergency situation would be a real hard thing to control.
Yeah, it'd be too hard to define.
An emergency could be that your well broke, right? Like I had loss of electrical power, my generator broke.
I spilled my water because I forgot to shut the valve off last night.
Malfunction here or there.
Well, I think that could be defined, but I think, you know, again, we're talking about 2,500, you know, if we're talking about 2,500 square foot. And then if we've just got a track record, you know, say this guy, you know, had 14 emergency water deliveries, you know, well, that's not probably an emergency then anymore. You know, we know that's not an emergency now because we have 14 permits on file in 12 months. And so we just need to evaluate whether that license is appropriate at that location, if it's got the appropriate infrastructure to continue, really.
So you're basically, instead of putting a limit of number of tankers or a limited number of times of an emergency, putting on a permitted
pretty easy permit
water
to get,
truck.
you know, just a quick permit, but we're tracking what's happening.
So it's
there.
on record.
It's part of their record.
So you do
with
it
their
more
license.
through performance standards, basically.
It was, so you know, the person could then come forward and say, yeah, I had 17 deliveries last year, but look, I got a permit and I, you know, improved my well or my water holding capability. So maybe that person, you know, could prove to the county that they should move forward. Whereas, well, you haven't done anything about it and you've done 17 truckloads, you know, that's, you probably don't have the appropriate infrastructure.
I see you.
Well,
Yeah.
and also as the enforcement aspect of it, trying to keep this as simple as possible to make people law-abiding, to make it easy to be law-abiding. If we start adding, because water is only one ancillary consequence, there's other vehicle traffic that's going to be on there. There's worker employees that are going to be going up there if it's a larger operation.
Yeah.
So if we just pigeonhole this one aspect of it, I think it's not going to be really fruitful, especially if we start adding on restrictions or regulatory compliance that we would have a difficulty trying to enforce, because enforcement's going to be a perpetual issue for us because availability of resources. So, I mean, I think it needs to be a consideration, but I don't know if it's something that we may need to restrict or if it's just going to be part of the permitting process to understand what the plan is to make sure it's sound.
Sure. Yeah, that one is, it's hard to enforce. You know, the state has a lot of paperwork requirements, but I mean, it comes down to the willingness of a professional to, you know, break rules, you know, as licensed professionals, you know, it's easier to do things legally and not risk your license, so. Okay.
So, yeah, that's
Density, I
water.
want to talk about density.
I think density is the, you're talking about density like.
Space between farms.
Farms.
You know, how dense.
So I think that's a
operation
function
setback.
of, that's a real function of size of each farm, you know, and, you know, you say 2,500, and I would think you would want a lot more than that as a minimum size, but we haven't all really hashed that part out yet about what we're
Yeah, I
thinking
just
is
thought of it as
appropriate.
it's like kind of an experimental size, but I
So
thought-
is 500 square foot on indoor,
Right.
but
I thought about
we all
5.
kind of determined that 500 square foot on indoor isn't really a viable business for somebody necessarily. You know, a 2,500 square foot garden is a lot more of a, closer to a single person operation where you're not actually bringing in employees, which is kind of part of the goal, a little bit of what we've kind of been talking about is creating jobs. You know, I don't know how many plants per se, because plants can be of all different sizes, but in a 2,500 square foot garden, I mean, you're probably talking about 50 or less plants.
No, much more than that. Well, it depends on how you farm it. You could be much less than that or much more than that.
So a lot of the larger plants that you see on outdoor gardens are taking up like 10 square foot apiece.
My design plan
Or,
for
I
a
mean,
small
100,
garden.
10 by 10, maybe?
My design plan for a small garden is about 50 plants per 500 square foot garden bed space, and you'd have 5 of those for a 2,500 foot garden, so you'd have 250 plants on rotation.
For smaller plants,
So you'd have 2 to 3 rotations, so you'd be dealing with 500 to 750 plants of production in a season. In order to achieve that production, you'd probably be producing close to 1,000 nursery stock plants. So it's a lot of work. It depends on how you work it. Like, it's like strawberries as an example. Like, there's different ways you can farm strawberries. I've seen super intensive 5-acre strawberry farms that produce really huge quantities of super premium strawberries, and they require a lot of labor to do it. And I've seen giant farms in Oxnard that produce lower quality strawberries en masse, and it's different. Their yield per acre is very different. And so when you're dealing with limitations, like huge permit costs for one, for licenses, and then just, you know, the limitations in your county, you have to find ways to really intensively farm and maximize your
Yeah,
space.
precisely, but I'm just trying to put it in the perspective that someone maybe could visualize. And some people may be familiar with seeing a single large plant that someone's growing out there. You know, they see a big plant that's bigger than a person, right? And it's just, you know, 10 feet tall, and it's large. And on 2,500 square foot, a single season operation, there's going to be 25 of those.
25 plants, yeah.
25 plants, that's
Maybe
where I'm getting
25
at.
to 50 plants.
25 to 50 plants
Yeah.
in a 2,500
If you
square
farm, if
foot
you farm
row,
that way, you can do it yourself, and you know, your total revenue at the end of the year is going to be much less. It's going to support you and maybe your seasonal help at the end of the year, because that way of farming, you're probably going to have, your harvest is going to come in all at once. So you're going to keep, you know, yourself busy all year, and then you're going to need a handful of people for 3 weeks or something. And then you're processing, you'll need a bunch of people for processing, or just a few people to process all year long. Although the state has some interesting taxation rules that kind of make you want to process your product in less than 60 days, because of they want you to weigh it within 60 days and pay taxes and this stuff. So, yeah, no, you're right. I think 5,000 is a good place to start for places that have better access. You know, like Eric talked about, you know, he'd like to go a little larger. He's got a place that's accessed by the pavement. Then you could have traffic and employees and all of that. But no, I mean, an intensively farmed 2,500 square foot operation could employ 4 people year round. You know, the track and trace compliance alone is like 20 hours a week, it looks like to me, when I look at the regulations. And you're out there like picking leaves off of your plants through the season, and you have to collect all those and weigh it and enter all that into the track and trace system. You can't like go out and pick yellow leaves off your plants and throw them on the ground anymore. It's like all those little things add up, and it's, the more I read it, the more daunting it is. You know, the more I think, who in the hell could ever do this? You know?
That's what this whole process feels like to me. We're gonna get to the end of this.
Yeah. I'd be happy if we get one successful applicant.
The state is
gonna
already
be me.
putting a ton on this and then taxing it pretty heavily. You know, I was looking the other day, I have spent 840 hours at about a cost of $60,000 to the county on cannabis.
See, so there's
I hope it was worth it.
So there's a perfect way to justify your costs of an application fee.
And you're only one. How much has Heidi spent and how much has Justin spent? And, you know, so I mean,
Yeah, $200,000 in county salary and benefits is easy. We've easily done that.
I think these meetings cost the county $2,500 a meeting or something, staff time.
Well, 4 or 5, $350 an hour.
All right. Well, let's get busy. We're wasting staff, county, money, time.
So that's where I come up with, I get the 2,500 square foot. I don't like that. I mean, I can't be the only one that doesn't like that, but I like it to be more.
I don't like it forever.
The number I put in there is 12,500. It's 5 times the 500. We went at the other direction when the other thing where, 500 square foot was the smallest.
There's just so
and we
few
went at it 5
places that are
times.
suitable for that.
Maybe not. I mean, a normal greenhouse, like a little Quonset house or a hooped house that a lot of people think of, those are 2,500 square foot, one of them. They're oftentimes 100 foot long by 20 or 30 feet wide.
You're going to run up to water issues. I mean, there's not a lot of
Maybe,
places around here where we
but,
have heat
you
and
know,
water.
that's where the whole,
All of that is already addressed in your state license, and, you know, so, I mean, you're just stopping growth if you're gonna say you're gonna run up against that. I mean, if you want to pay for that permit and do that size of a garden, are we gonna restrict everything?
Yeah.
I guess part of the reason I'm coming up with that point is that if the notion is that none of these lands can support anything more than that, then why are we talking about it? Because if it's anything more than that, then the point is that if these are going to become viable businesses that help the community, you know, financially or just in general, then they need to be larger than 2,500 square foot in the long run, at least, at minimum.
Is there any benefit to starting, is there any ease to the county in setting up the program by starting smaller? It just, intuitively, it seemed like dealing with considering much larger farms is going to slow down the whole project.
It might.
But maybe I'm wrong.
It might. I mean,
maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the case-by-case assessment of the permits can allow a much wider range than I'm thinking.
Well, the only problem I have is if you started a lot smaller, I do not know how much growth you're going to get through your board of supervisors if you wanted to go larger.
I think you do if you have a viable business that's operating, has receipts, has employees, and says, we want to double our operation. We got space, we got infrastructure, we're going to create more jobs. I think at that point, that's when the board says, right, we got an example here of a working operation who wants to go bigger.
well, maybe there's something in between. I mean, maybe 5,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet. I don't know where the economy of scale starts to make sense.
Right. Other
But-
growers groups like in Humboldt say if you want to eliminate or reduce the speculative component, the land bubble component, the large investment component, then you keep it under 10,000 square feet. And I thought, wow, that's pretty big still, you know, but the idea is like in Humboldt, a lot of people say we're not even going to go into business unless we can start at 10,000 square feet. We're not viable at anything less than 10,000 square feet. These are bigger operations.
With your knowledge, what is the normal size that you know of in this area now? I mean, is there anybody
Humboldt?
doing 10,000 in Del Norte?
Here, not in the timberland that I know of, but not in like the
You
kind of
say,
places
yeah,
we're
you
talking
know of.
about.
Okay.
But in Humboldt, that's, you know, that's tiny. Lots of acre grows in Humboldt in the mountains.
Yeah, and let's not forget also, the smaller you make this initially, the less compliance you bring in. The less people are apt to say, well, I'll go get a permit, because if he's already, that person is already at 10 or 20,000 square foot of growing, he's not going to come to the county for a permit for 2,500 and shut down 3/4 of his unregulated business. You know, he's just not going to do it. So.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. I would get a permit for 2,500 square feet and keep going the way I was going. And
We need to determine the size where we get jobs, and then determine can we get that size on these parcels, you know. But in any case, you know, back to Kurt's comment about what's the point of, you know, this regardless of the size, is that there are a few, you know, individuals who have been producing there and have been part of the economy.
I just don't know where that is
So
in
they can be
timberland,
brought in.
honestly, unless we're talking about South and Klamath country. You know, I don't know any timberland like north up here that's supporting any operations that size. It's just,
How many employees
maybe there's
is-
one, but there isn't 10, you know.
How many employees is a 10,000 square foot operation?
Like
I
we
mean,
keep
how-
getting back to, it depends on how intense you're running it. Like you can,
How many cars are showing up at this property down these dirt gravel roads?
my argument is that because of the limitation, most people are going to be inclined to run these operations as intensively as possible. You're going to try to squeeze as much out of your square footage as you can, which means bringing lots of people to the operation. Doesn't mean that it wouldn't be more efficient to just go bigger, But let's say that's your limit. All you can do is 5,000 feet or 10,000 feet. You're going to really maximize that land. You're going to pump it. And the more intensively you farm, the more labor you have. So a 10,000 foot garden that was really run at its maximum, we're talking like, lots of HVAC equipment, heating and cooling, and you're running year round, maybe you're running 5 or 6 crops a year, really intensively. And so you're constantly harvesting, like every, maybe even the rotation is even more than that. So you're in this constant rotational cycle. So you have all your people there all the time. You got stuff going on at night. You got 2 processing crews. So you're running 24 hours a day. That's dozens of cars every day.
Well, this is the conversation that the county gets in and what we get in to, where do you draw the line when you're off the grid? Because we've already talked about the fact that we're not going to allow indoor operations off the grid. They have to be on the power grid because you're using X amount of power. Now, what we're talking about is a mixed light situation where you're tarping or you're adding light potentially during certain times of the year, and so you're using electricity under the indoor threshold.
And for your processing and your drying and for your employees, you're going to be using electricity also. And your propagation area, your vegetation area. If you're running a year-round operation with multiple cropping, you're planting every several weeks, you're running vegetative lights in a separate space that doesn't count against your permitted production space. You have a 10,000 square foot permitted production space, you can have 10 or 20,000 square feet of vegetative nursery space.
But again, this falls back to what the county wants to do. This falls back to, the county could not allow that if they so chose to. They could say no lighted growing area within your permit. Then you would be forced to look elsewhere for your vegetative product for that particular piece of property. So there's all different angles at which the county can try to contain that particular issue. But the scenario you're putting out there is, running right up to the threshold of needing all this electricity and running all these generators.
I'm just saying what people could do, but we definitely could, I suppose we could define something where so there's another license type where it's just individual plants on non-contiguous plots, 25 or 50, and that's under the same price as a 2,500 square foot license type. You can do 25 plants on non-contiguous plots, but it doesn't give you a restriction. So you could grow massive, huge plants spread out in a pretty big area, do it the old style, just one person, 1 or 2 people in a big area.
Probably in that scenario, you could probably push to almost 5,000 or maybe a little more growing space with those 25 plants, because
go to 50.
You could almost make them
plants.
200 square foot each or something like that. Making them too much more bigger than that becomes a viability problem of how much are you really putting into them to get them to that size before the right time.
But if you're working by yourself, that's the way to farm it, because you're not dealing with tons of plants and tons of watering and all this individual care. And taking care of 50 giant plants is probably easier than running, light deprivation hoops and greenhouses and tons of little plants. It's different. And then what you're producing, like CBD plants that are grown and harvested for extraction, totally different labor set. Like one person could probably pull in 50 or 100 pounds, before it went bad, if you're just doing it for extraction. But if you're producing top quality hand trimmed flower, that's going to take, 5 or 10 people to pull in 100 pounds in time, so it depends on what
you're talking about, the processing and all that stuff, and there's a function of within your permit through the county, are you going to allow someone to on-site process when they're off the grid and all these different things? Because that does entail, like you say, more traffic, more power, or are they going to say, well, we need to have off-site processing in these, when you don't have A, B, and C?
Yeah, Humboldt did that. They have separate rules and requirements for your processing if you do on-site processing. It's just, I don't know how much into those details the county is ready to get. That's what I'm saying. It makes the project much, much larger. If you limit it small, it kind of covers it no matter how you're running it. It doesn't get to be this huge thing, this huge monster that you have to get into all these different details of controlling the scale and the impact of how it runs.
Yeah, but then you're controlling growth.
Yeah, but it's not forever. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, is that if we're going to do something that allows for that kind of individual control, that's a program that's going to take a long time to design the details of, I would think.
Well, I agree, but I just think that once we get something going through this Board of Supervisors, it's going to be a long time before you change it. So, I mean, if you start at the 2,500, you should probably at least go to the 5 or the 10, and people may not go to that limit. They could do 2,500s, but, you know.
I gotcha.
No, part of where I come from with this whole, the square footage thing, it's a real function of what are we going to allow on certain pieces of property. Like I was just mentioning, you've got the power issues, you've got all of those things that kind of maybe mitigate how you use your property. Like, for example, if you're going to go so intensive in that square footage by using all the different measures that you just kind of somewhat described, then yeah, maybe the larger square footages aren't necessary. But if you're going to limit the fact that how much power you can use and all of these different things, well, then you're looking into more of the, you know, needing those more square footages to make your viable business, you know, your business viable. So it's coming at it in two different ways.
There's some public comment coming up here.
Hi, everybody. My name's Russell. Thanks for your time. I do like the idea of starting small, like Jesse said, 2,500 square feet, but I do think that maybe the board's going to take a long time to ever get around to raising that. So I would be in support of something like 5,000 square feet off-grid, maybe 10,000 square feet on-grid or something like that, or maybe even have another classification like off-grid on a dirt road, maybe only let 2,500 square feet or something like that. So that's what I was thinking about that. And I just had a question about like the nursery license. Are we going to be able to apply for state nursery license and fit into the framework in the tax proposition? Are we going to be, I'm guessing we're going to get taxed as indoor flowers if we try to pull a nursery permit and grow it inside.
So are you talking about just a normal nursery license like Home Depot has, or something else?
Like
cultivation.
No, there's a whole specific nursery licensing under the state. And it's essentially what you're doing is you're growing vegetative plants and you're not bringing them to flower. You're growing vegetative plants for other people
you
to
get to
take
drive them around
to like other nurseries for them to flower, for example. And you know, in most scenarios, I would think that when you're doing that, you wouldn't exactly be coming under the indoor threshold of a state license or anything like that. You'd be using it's a nursery license for one, but you also wouldn't be using that level of electricity for your lights.
LEDs or something.
So the light threshold part of it would be under the indoor classification of it. I would assume, although again I haven't read any of these things.
It's using exclusively artificial light, though, regardless of the level, puts you in indoor.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sorry, remember I was just reading that.
But the viability of that license, in my opinion, would not be using exclusively artificial light. It would be using.
Yeah, and the square footage doesn't work. We didn't include nursery taxation.
Yeah, I was about to say that nurseries are probably categorically different from indoor, outdoor.
It would be like gross revenue.
But so the difference, so let me throw this out there for you. If you tax the nursery, you're double taxing the product because you're taxing that plant.
That's taxed 10 times.
So for example, if a person is growing indoor flower themselves and they have the ability to grow their own vegetative plants, well, you're not taxing the vegetative plants, you're taxing the flowering plants. That's what you're taxing. You're taxing that square footage that's used for flowering, and you're not taxing their vegetative space. And so I would think that you wouldn't apply the tax to a nursery situation because you're going to eventually tax those plants anyway.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the definition of indoor is, or the cultivation area is for flowering plants or mature plants or
flower production.
Flower production. So I would say it's probably categorically different, and probably it would be untaxed unless if we wanted to do nurseries, probably it's going to be a nursery use permit. You wouldn't get an indoor and outdoor use permit.
Right.
And then maybe in there, you consent to being taxed one way or the other, maybe depending on your operation.
Right.
Gotcha.
Something, we'd have to rig something.
So the one way that you wouldn't double tax the product, for example, would be if, in this situation, it could eventually lead to you'd be, as a nursery, you could be selling plants to shops, let's say, as opposed to growers, where they can sell them to people, right, that want to buy them for their house.
That's another thing, like,
Yeah,
are there gonna
you
be
can't
Those
do that.
scenarios,
retail nurseries? Like, can somebody open up a
They're different
plant
licenses.
shop?
different
It's
licenses.
different licenses. There's retail nurseries and wholesale nurseries, but you can't sell the plants. You can only sell them to other license holders. And now in terms of how retail to non-license holders, I'm not clear on that detail.
I've never thought about it. It's never crossed my mind.
Well,
Yeah.
well, with
Because
the-
dispensaries can't sell plants anymore.
Well, with this,
Retail outlets
So
can.
how are you supposed to buy plants if you can grow 6 plants?
Right.
Where are you supposed to get them from?
I think that a retail nursery can sell, you know, under a specified quantity without the track and trace tag, you know, retail, I suppose. But that actually, I don't know that detail.
Okay, thanks. I didn't mean to throw you guys off track. You're doing great.
No, thank you. We need
Yeah, those are
other
good
tracks
questions.
to go on.
Those are good. We need to be anticipating down the road, or else we
Yeah.
make mistakes. You know, as far as the allowing more if you're on grid, I like that because it's easy to sell.
Yeah.
People say, why 5,000, why 10,000? Well, it's on the grid. Okay. Okay.
It's done. Yeah, Eric, I think, would go for that.
You know, how much is really on the grid, right? Really, you're along the highway? Is there any other kind of on-grid timberland?
There's not a lot, no. Southbrook's all off the line. And sure. I mean, it's kind of funny because, like with a Kubota diesel and some biofuel, you can produce cleaner power than you can the grid, but we don't talk about that.
Well, I am amenable to a regime. You know, in the operation plan, you're going to say how you're going to get your electricity, your water, you're going to deal with your roads, how many employees you have. If you can come in with this plan that says, I've got biofuels and a generator and look how clean it is, I'm amenable to a regime that lets staff poke at that without hard rules. It's a little more vague. Staff might not like it, but I like it.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Heidi's gone, so we can promise weird stuff.
Right. Yeah, well, so we do the same thing when you're gone. We talk about all kinds of things that are not legal and you can't do. Right. Okay. On-grid and off-grid is an easy way to kind of allow size changes. Yeah, just leaving it kind of totally to, you know, out in the open for the process to determine all the different details is a little bit hard because of all the different ways that you can utilize a given square footage.
Yeah.
You really can do it lightly on the land or with a lot of impacts on your surroundings. And there isn't a really, you could, like Kurt was saying, you could define it with the ordinance, what you allow going on site and what you don't. But that would require more monitoring and, you know, a lot more detail in the ordinance with how to make it function and not be so restrictive to business that it doesn't even work. But it's actually, on the other hand, it's enforceable in some way, and that just seems like there's a lot of back and forthing going there.
Yeah, so the more of a negotiation the permit is at the staff level, the more work that's going to be for staff. Heidi has some kind of preliminary numbers. The board wanted us to raise the cost of a use permit. I think, you know, it's like $1,700 right now. I think her preliminary numbers were like over 4,000. So there's going to be cost. And I guess maybe the more we specify in the ordinance, maybe no promises, but maybe the cheaper that permit can be. On the other hand,
Smaller, cheaper,
smaller, cheaper.
less complicated.
Yeah, the more factors that, you know, if we have to be doing studies of road impacts, A, we're gonna make the applicant pay for it, and then spend a bunch of staff time looking at it. But that's the flexibility, right? You gotta balance that. Do you want the flexibility, or do you want a cheap permit with an easy application that allows very little?
I think some variation is good there. I think that for people who have no interest in going over 2,500 square feet, they should have, you know, maybe a faster, simpler process to go through that isn't as onerous as somebody else who wants to, you know, max out at 10,000 square feet with 20 employees or something, you know.
Yeah, we can look at tiered, like right now we have like a major and a minor use permit, but all commercial use permits are major. But if we have a kind of a cannabis use permit fee schedule, you know, retail is not going to cost very much on staff relative to a 10,000 square foot outdoor grow on timberland off the grid with a weird water situation and a bad road. Like those are going to be drastically different situations for us.
I don't know your use permit structuring and how that all works, because again, this is all going to function through the use permitting process, right? So it's an individual use permit, but I don't know if it's possible to make the cost of the use permit different based upon the different square footages, you know, just like like you were saying, and I think it's absolutely correct that the state brings you in at a 2,500 square foot. The next tier is a 5,000, and the next tier is a 10,000. So based upon these ranges, your use permit would be, you know, double or triple the cost of the guy at 2,500, you know?
Yeah, $1 a foot, maybe.
Yeah. So, you know, the way that our system is operating here, where you have up to, say, for the manufacturing ordinance, you have up to 5,000 square feet. But if you come in and you have an operation plan that says 2,000 square feet, right? You might still have to pay for that 5,000 square foot license from the state, but we don't have to make it so you pay for a 5,000 square foot license from us. So maybe if it's really a bunch of kind of constituent parts in the use permit, it could be a la carte. You know, you're paying for a biological assessment. You're paying a fee for us to read that biological assessment. If you didn't need it, you wouldn't have that in your permit.
I got you.
You know, it could be broken down, kind of maximum flexibility, but you know, it's Heidi's staff time and expenses, and I'm not doing the math, she is, so again, cool. She's not here to defend herself, so I don't know. You know, that might be a burdensome situation too, I don't know.
These kind of things may apply to indoor as well. I mean, it really is, the way that you work that too can vary in intensity. You can, you know, it's the same kind of animal. You can run, you know, run it hard, or you can run it by yourself and take breaks in between your rounds. You know, so.
Yeah, I like the idea of the operation plan, because you can go in and say, this is what I'm going to do, this is how it's going to happen, this is kind of, these are the impacts, and then we hold you to it, right? That's what you applied for, that's what you're going to do. And so we just need a fee schedule that varies with that, I think, is what needs to happen. Well, we can figure something out.
Perfect.
So we're getting close to the end here.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is everybody on board with this ordinance to go forward to the ERC tomorrow?
Yeah, this is just the coastal.
I haven't read it, but I'm not going to stand in the way of pushing forward and letting this thing go through. I mean, I can sit here and read it, and I would say that one-on-one, I'm in disagreement with a lot of the stuff on there, but as a voice, as a universal voice up here, we've all kind of come to some consensuses, and I'm assuming that those are all in there in that same way. Otherwise, someone probably would have already said something.
Yeah, it looks
so
like
yeah,
exactly
on a one-on-one basis, I don't like it, but as a group, as a whole, as a representation of the community, I think it's a good centerpiece to move forward with it. So don't let me hold you up.
Just kind of glancing at it, I like, he said, I didn't read it word for word, which I should, but I think it's something that could be palatable to the board. and I think that's what you're catering to. And like Kurt said, some of it in here is probably not what I would do individually if I was to do it, but since we are catering to the board and their wishes trying to get something through in time, I think it's written very well.
I feel the same way. Ditto.
Yeah. You're welcome to. I think, you know, I didn't talk about that, but there in here is one little sentence that says no cultivation within a tribal boundary without express written consent of that tribe. That is less protection than the Yurok tribe wanted. But when I brought this to the board, kind of with the option of let's pause this and solve this issue and do government-to-government meetings, or send it through with a placeholder, they were all in favor of sending it through with a placeholder, with what I think seemed like a pretty good understanding that we weren't probably going to issue any permits that the tribe was not on board with. Mm-hmm. And Ellie has the idea that Humboldt did of a kind of an interim ban in the traditional cultural area. And, you know, you brought that up. Nobody said one way or the other on the board what they thought of it, but I think it is, I mean, I don't have any problem with that.
So just to be clear, I'll just also say what the discussion was. It's our position that the tribes just haven't had a chance to have their G2G with the county, and that there are enforcement issues and other things that are going on in the more far outlying areas. So the tribe's position, Yurok tribe's position, is those G2Gs should occur not only with the county but also between the tribes, just so that everybody knows what everybody's opinions are in the ancestral lands. So on reservation, basically each tribe would have control over their own reservation and whether or not there'd be permitting and would accept or not accept, depending on what the government wanted to do. And in the ancestral lands, we would have those G2G meetings. So my request or recommendation is that there be a ban on permitting in the ancestral lands until those G2Gs occur. So there would just be an interim while those discussions went on, rather than have permitting occurring prior to that. So that's the request from the Yurok tribe.
You know, if you have a map of those lands and moratorium language, you know, we can kind of vet that through council, and then maybe, I don't know.
Those Yurok lands are everything south of Damnation Creek.
Well,
right?
Yeah, right. But there's a specific map that
we can certainly send that map over to you. And would you like that today?
Yeah, in the next few weeks.
There's an overlap between Tolowa and Yurok territory, but what she just said was that the Yuroks want a moratorium, no issuing of anything south of Damnation Creek until there's a G2G meeting. Right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, we're not going to be issuing any permits with a functioning thing until at least 30 days after December 11th. So there isn't really an emergency justifying a moratorium until 30 days after that. So that's our time frame.
Yeah, because what we've already moved forward with was specific to an area in Crescent City, right, with the
retail and manufacturing
stuff. So that doesn't enter into that area. So this cultivation ordinance, which is still trying to move forward tomorrow with indoor and whatnot, that would be the first thing that would actually potentially be into that area. And of course, we still haven't heard from other tribes.
Right.
And obviously, other tribes should weigh in if they wish to, so it's up to them. We don't want to force them to if they don't have an opinion, but that's our position, is that everybody has a voice.
Heidi's here. Can we ask her a couple questions before we wrap up? We had a few things that you kept wanting to bounce back over there. So I forget all of them.
I forget all of them.
Should I leave?
You should get out of here.
I had second thoughts about coming in.
One thing the most recent thing was on structuring use permits that were flexible in cost. You know, kind of depending on if it's going to be a 2,500 square foot grow or a 10,000, or if it's going to be on grid or off grid, and whether you thought we could kind of have constituent parts, like you pay an off-grid fee as part of your use permit, or you pay an off, you know, I don't know what.
So they don't all cost the same, so that simple permits cost less and much more complicated permits cost more?
Potentially, we could look at that. I mean, you know, we do that with minor and major subdivisions. A minor subdivision obviously has fewer impacts, but presumably, or, you know, you're looking at a smaller area than a major subdivision. So it's something we could look into.
Okay. We're trying to find a way to allow larger grows without holding up the smaller ones from being able to work their way through the department, I guess.
Yeah, so, you know, I think the cost to the county in time is not going to be maybe based on size, but on other things in the operation plan.
Yeah,
like,
there are a lot of costs
you know,
that are pretty much the same regardless of what the project is. Obviously, when you have more environmental issues that you're trying to avoid or mitigate for, that's going to add time to the permit review at a variety of different points that a variety of different staff people are involved in, which can cause the price to escalate. But obviously, if it's a smaller operation with fewer impacts, then there would be less.
right, if you're on a paved road, you know, you might not need so much staff time assessing your road impacts.
Not on the front end you would, in order to make that finding, but on the back end, if you wouldn't necessarily have conditions that would
Right.
need to be followed up upon by our engineering staff or roads division following the approval.
Yeah, so all of that, I guess, we'll kind of deal with as we flesh out the ordinance. Other things we talked about, Heidi, water trucking, electricity, monitoring groundwater so that, you know, wells aren't going dry in a particular area of density. Traffic on these roads. We talked about whether rural residential as a land use designation might be more appropriate for low divide than timberland if they're smaller parcels.
So
and
you would
whether or
be
not
looking
that was
at doing
worth
a
it.
general plan amendment and rezone? If
Yeah.
you were to do that, I would also suggest taking the same tack that we took with the Cannabis Business District and doing an overlay.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't
So
necessarily
yeah.
go beyond the area that we really want to see the activities.
That's what I was thinking. I'm just not sure if there's going to be enough properties there to
Yeah,
justify
is
that
that too big of a
cost.
project for the area?
Pretty big
you know,
project.
for what it-
Well, that would be a project that wouldn't be specific to just one location. There would be probably, if that was your means of fixing that problem, that would be something that would overlay into a lot of different areas, right? Like,
Well, like if
It's
we're
not a
going
lot.
to open the general plan to fix everything, it's a big job.
yeah.
If we're going to fix just, you know, one issue of,
Well, you say low divide, but there, I would think about, there's probably like at least 6 or 8 different general locations like that.
It's French
where
Hill,
that problem
Rowdy Creek.
where
comes
it's
into
where
effect.
it's a
There's
timberland
places
land use
in Klamath,
designation on
there's-
small parcels.
There's
Well,
all these different
they're
places.
getting developed. Rowdy Creek, I don't think has small parcels. I think the smallest ones I've seen out there are 20s. But it's, you know, it's developed more than what you'd think of as timberland, you know.
Well, in order to avoid, I guess, that the idea of the overlay, I mean, you could just really create a new unique rural residential zoning, which would be the 10 acre, because that doesn't exist anywhere else in the county, and if you only limited it to those however many areas. Do you remember when we met and we looked at the maps and we kind of were identifying those areas? They
Right.
primarily the same, except we didn't look in Klamath, I don't think.
Right.
We just,
Heidi, in the general plan, when the underlying land use designation is rural residential, is there a minimum lot size on those?
yeah, I mean, we
So
have
we-
our one for one,
Right.
I'm thinking non-coastal, which this is what we're looking at.
So we'd have to create a new land use designation of
Yeah.
RR10. Do you think that would be a major general plan revision? Or do you think that would be something we can do just,
I think it would be a major general plan revision. I mean, we've looked at this elsewhere in the county. It was actually predates my employment with the county, and they were looking at an EIR for it. And that was just looking at the big flat area.
You were supposed to say that was minor, because Jill doesn't like it when you say major.
I'm sorry.
Would it be a minor or major general plan amendment? This is all new to me, for the the Forestry Act to make that 20 acres acceptable?
I would think not, because you're not changing the underland land use, you're just finding another zone designation that's already compatible with it. I mean, the 40-acre minimum lot size, I don't know why that was ever created, because there isn't I mean, there has never been a consistent land use designation that required a 40-acre minimum. And I know there are probably AF parcels that are less than 40 acres in size. I think that's kind of where we started at just after 10 with the inconsistencies in lot sizes and zoning and land use.
Well, that sounds like, to confirm, that's the easiest route to go, is to make an adjustment on the ag forestry minimum and then require rezoning.
I think so. And so that will put the burden on the applicant, you know, to rezone, but, you know, that makes it more palatable for staff. Because if we're going to rezone all like PO land to AF, you know, we would never, it would just.
That would not be an option.
Right.
I mean, if we were going to rezone PO land, I mean, it would be very thoughtful, where we would look at each area where we have the PO and try to find something that matches it. I don't think we would just do an across-the-board AF or.
And so that's a major project.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Major expense in publishing and hearings. And
sure. So for our next meeting,
CEQA,
we can
major
continue
CEQA.
on some of these details. We have a good kind of basis for it here. In the past, when we talked about this, we had a 1,000-foot setback from residential zone properties. We didn't really talk about that again today, but that seemed appropriate. We can talk about those kind of details, and then maybe some details about what sizing is appropriate where, you know, if we're going to talk about going up to 10,000 square feet on ideal conditions, you know, or not, you know. So let's maybe agendize that to continue the discussion.
And we have a meeting scheduled for Monday the 20th? Something like that? Okay.
Yes, Monday the 22nd. Okay, so we're skipping a little bit. That'll be 12 days.
22nd?
Yeah, that's what I have here. I don't have a calendar. Okay. I don't know if we will ever talk about it, Joel, but I would like to talk about collectives.
Oh, yeah.
And the future, and we kind of didn't.
It's been on my back burner because I think it's a
right.
cool thing that might be a great benefit.
Okay. We didn't want to. We didn't. No, not talking about cooperatives under the licensing model, but like.
You're talking about the existing.
The old school thing
okay,
that we wanted that you never wanted to deal with the personal cultivation thing. Right, and I don't know if it's appropriate to talk about it or not, but I just wanted to shoot that out there if that's something we can get into in the future.
We can get into
just
it.
because the county's going to have some policy of, I don't know if they're going to have a policy, but they might be wise to have a policy about how to proceed with that.
Well, I mean, strictly speaking, it is a public nuisance, not criminal, right? The immunity still exists, but it's a public nuisance, and as soon as there are a bunch of neighbor complaints and it becomes kind of important to go enforce, then we can decide whether or not it's worth the resources.
All right.
But I don't think a county policy that, yeah, it's okay, keep going,
Sure.
is going to happen.
Okay. And then we also, there's some movement at the state level on the hemp program, new bill signed by the governor, 1409, I think it is, and
Yeah.
some positive changes. And so we didn't talk when we were having our ag land discussion about how hemp might get along with cannabis. And may be another good reason to have kept outdoor cannabis out of ag lands, to keep it reserved for hemp. So we could, at some point, maybe talk about that briefly when Blake is here. I know he's interested in that too.
Yeah, I'll look at that and see if there's any interaction there.
Okay. So that's about it for the next agenda. Anything else before we shut it down?
Just come to the planning commission.
Yes, what's the date?
I think it's the 3rd, 7th, November something.
Were there any changes to the draft? Okay. So I will give that to planning, so they'll have it for tomorrow's meeting.
Yeah.
We got confirmation on the planning commission schedule?
November 7th is the first Wednesday in November. I don't know.
That sounds right. That's
Okay.
it.
Joel's trip. Okay. Planning commission meeting, November 7th. Be there. That's right. Okay. Sounds good. Thanks everybody for coming. Meeting adjourned.